Hello, welcome everyone to the MIMI interim meeting. It's 3 o'clock, so I think we can kick off, although our first presenter is not here yet, but maybe he will be here by the time we get to him. So Tim, can you advance the slide? So just a reminder, this session is covered by the IETF Note Well, which is inclusive of a variety of different policies that the IETF imposes on its activities, including IPR, code of conduct, and other things. So please take note of it. Next. We are looking for a volunteer for a note taker for this session. Is there anybody who's willing to take notes? Just needs to kind of capture high level points of agreement and disagreement. Doesn't need to be like a transcript because we'll have a transcript, I think. Any generous soul who would like to take some notes for us today?
I can take notes. Oh, someone in chat.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Conrad. Okay, thanks. Next slide. Okay, so here is our agenda for today. First hour is going to focus on transport and signaling architecture, and we're going to get an update from the design team. So Richard will be leading this discussion, but we left a lot of time for lots of interactivity on this one. He also published a draft just yesterday, which he sent to the list. So hopefully folks had a time to take a look at that. If not, you can reference it as we go along. We'll give that as much time as it needs. This is our first set of deliverables all relate to this transport architecture. So we'll spend our time there as needed. If it takes about an hour, then we'll have an hour left, and second hour we'll focus on user discovery requirements, really looking specifically at discovery. Looking specifically at requirements and not solutions. So we have a bunch of different presenters lined up for this, Jonathan and Ecker, to kick off and provide sort of overview and sort of points of discussion for the rest of the group. And then Giles and Vittorio, who have more specific proposals from their respective drafts. And we left some time at the end there for discussion. We might need to kind of rejigger a little bit based on people's conflicts and some people having to leave early, but we will do our best. Giles, did you have a question?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this.
The interface.
Yeah.
Okay. It looks like you raised your hand to be in the queue, at least from my interface. That's what it looks like. So whenever you have a question, you should hit the raise hand button. You'll get in the queue, and we'll run the queue as normal, just like we did in the in-person meeting. But for now, you don't need to be in the queue if you don't have a question. So.
Okay.
Any bashes to the agenda or questions or comments that people have on the agenda? Okay, then I think we can kick it over to Richard.
Hello, am I audible here? Looks like it. Can someone confirm I'm audible?
You're audible.
All right, thank you. Rowan, you're already in the queue. Rowan, do you have a comment? Okay, assuming that is a spurious in queuing from Rowan. All right, so I apologize. I just got into the room here and I missed the whole chair's intro. But what I was going to present here is an update from the design team that we discussed back at the IETF meeting. give folks an update on kind of what the design team's been discussing and how far we've gotten. And one of the outputs of snapshots of what we've gotten so far is this architecture concept. The general approach here is that we've been trying to make an architecture that defines what the protocols are that we need and what they do, so that people design protocols that work well with each other when they go off to design protocols. Am I just supposed to say next slide here? Is Tim, you're driving? There you go. Yeah, go ahead. Next one. Yeah, so if you cast your mind back these several weeks to late July, we had some discussion at the IETF meeting about adopting some of the protocol drafts that existed then, and ended up not having consensus to adopt any of the things that were existing at that time. And so there was a suggestion from the working group that we get a smaller kind of design team together. I don't think it's an official working group design team, but I'm not bothered much by the process there. But it's a group getting together and trying to come up with a proposal for adoption in late September or so that has a little bit more broad base of consent, and involves you can see the list of folks here, involves authors of a bunch of the documents that exist. And so we're trying to take a bunch of the ideas in the existing proposals and mush them together into a framework that makes sense for everybody. So I'm going to give an update on what we've gotten so far. The plan, as was expressed at the IETF meeting, is to have some drafts ready for the working group to look at in the middle of September, with the idea that at a late September interim meeting, which I believe Doodle has gone around for, we could start doing some adoption calls. Hopefully have some adopted documents the working group can then work on. And to be clear and set expectations properly here, right? Obviously in the IETF, adopting a document does not mean the document's done. And so these documents should be, even once we've been through this design team process, should be reviewed as starting points, as points for further refinement. So that's the plan of record. Next slide, please. So we commissioned that design team back in July. Since then, the design team has been diligently working. We had a face-to-face meeting after the MIMI working group meeting. I think it was on the Friday morning of IETF week. And kind of had some initial discussion about what an architecture looks like and how the overall system fits together. There's been 3 design team calls since the IETF, of which, in all honesty, I missed 2 because I was on vacation, but I hear they got a lot of work done. Largely so far, I've been kind of discussing architecture approach and working through some basic example cases. So, what should it look like? What should the operations be when the room is created and someone is added to the room, et cetera. A couple of general bounding concerns and desiderata that have come up as I think understood goals of this effort. Obviously, as the charter says, end-to-end security based on MLS, but we're trying to phrase things a little more generally in case folks want to bridge in other stuff, not within the context of the working group, but defining a clear demarc in case someone else in some other context wants to do that. An interesting concept that came in, I think, starting from the discussion at the IETF meeting, was this idea of object level of authentication of protocol messages, which exists in some protocols now. This is emphasized to different degrees in different protocols. But I think this idea of a very pervasive authentication kind of came in from the MIMI-DS stuff and has infiltrated some of the ongoing ideas. I'll say more about that later. Another point of emphasis is this idea that, as the name of the working group implies, more interoperability. There should be some degree of incremental adaptability and some degree of transition story from current protocols. So those, kind of general ideas that are guiding the discussions are in the background of discussions that you'll kind of see coming up in some different ways in more details. So this draft I published yesterday, we've kind of had as a working document to prime the discussions. So we tried to capture areas where the design team has clear ideas and things we agree on, and also help drive the discussion forward by making some proposals in areas where there is ambiguity or disagreement. So it's it's a mishmash as it stands right now. It's what it means to be a working document. It's not the not authoritative. It's just trying to capture the state of where the discussion is right now. And as you'll see, if you look at the document, there's some things that are clearer. There's some notes in there flagging areas where more work is required or where there's a disagreement. Overall, most of the rest of the deck today is kind of going through the ideas in there and teeing up some discussion around some of those areas of disagreement. So you can have some real live design team discussion maybe in this working group call, and hopefully bring the rest of the working group in so they can understand where the design team's gotten to. Overall, though, I think we are pretty well on schedule for the September deadlines. I don't think the products we have coming out of the design team may not be real polished, real done, but as I said before, the point of adopting a document is to adopt a starting point that's pointed in the right direction. And I'm hopeful that having this architecture in mind, at least with some degree of fidelity, will give us some confidence in adopting these starting points, and because we'll have some idea that these starting points have the right shape, they're pointed in the right direction. I think that's my last slide on design team status. If anyone had questions or comments on design team before we dive into more interesting technical stuff. All right, next slide, please. Yeah, so at the IETF meeting, I had presented this some architectural thoughts as lead up to design questions, and had a footnote that someone should write a document. So now we have one. Obviously, as I said before, this is actively in progress. So everyone don your hard hats and other protective equipment, and let's dive in. Next slide, please. So this is a recap. You should recognize this slide. It was in the deck at the IETF meeting. The design team had some discussion about just confirming that we are in this client to server to server to server to client architecture, where there is a hub server and there are follower servers. The hub server is where a room is the organizing concept. Should be as in many messaging systems. Room is the organizing concept. There is a server to which that room is homed. We've been using the word hub for that and follower for other servers. And everything that happens in the room gets routed through that hub server. So clients access the system via their servers, via server for their provider. And then the servers exchange events, objects. The terminology is a little in flux, but there's things that the servers exchange with authentication that kind of make the room go. Some of these things capture messages that are the actual messaging functionality. Other things capture changes to the room, joins and leaves and that sort of thing. So hopefully this client to server to server to server to client architecture looks familiar to folks. Next slide, please. One area of clarification that came up in the discussions was whether we really mean that everything goes via the hub. And in particular, the thing that was a little unclear when the discussion started was, when someone at server A is trying to add a user at server B, the user at server A needs to fetch some information about server B to add them to the cryptographic state, unless it's called a key package. And so you could ask the question reasonably: does server A talk directly to server B to fetch that information? Or does that fetch go via the hub server, server C, where the room is hosted? And there was pretty clear agreement among the design team that, in fact, everything needs to go via the hub server. And the reasoning was something like the third bullet here, that as providers start opening up these open interfaces and start interconnecting with each other, it's not going to be the case that every server is willing to interact with every other server that's out there. So if server A and server B are both interacting with server C, which is the home of the room, then clearly A is willing to work with C and B is willing to work with C. And so there's a communication path there. And we should rely on that communication path instead of relying on also having a communication path between A and B. because A and B might not be willing to talk to each other if they've decided, each other, maybe A has decided that B is a spammy server, but it's willing to interact via server C in that specific context. So there may not be a communication channel with server A between A and B, and so everything, really everything in the channel goes via the hub. Really getting all three of those S's in there every time. Got to make sure we cross all the hops. Next slide, please. And people should feel free to NQ, ask questions, tell me I'm crazy at any point here. Hopefully this is all sounding pretty familiar, folks. Yeah, Alyssa.
I wanted to either ask or sort of point out that in the case where the hub, the recipient user is actually attached to the hub, there's only 2 servers involved. So like the number of
Correct.
S's in the middle is sort of less relevant than the hub and follower aspect. I know that we like to talk about which kind of protocol are we doing here, but I think it's sort of kind of like helpful to remember that because the difference between hub and follower is only meaningful in like for a subset of the conversation.
Correct. Yeah. I think it's accurate to say that there are in any given room at least 2 providers, at least 2 servers involved. So it's at least CSSC. I don't think we're anticipating that a single server would host things inside a provider. Although I guess providers could feel free if they build the right APIs. But I think we're pretty clear that everything that Mimi is doing is about the inter-server interactions. And secondarily, the when things are end-to-end, those client-to-client interactions. Yeah, Eric?
I have a preliminary question, which is this pronounced CISC or what?
I think it's
Okay, all right, like parcel
the
time, right?
The sibilant has to last at least 750 milliseconds.
Got it. Okay. Are you going to talk at some point in this conversation about the hub's responsibilities? Because this is just like saying it's forwarding the information, but are you going to talk more about responsibilities and whether there can be multiple hubs and this kind of stuff?
I don't have that in this deck, but let me try and summarize what I believe we've heard in the last IETF meeting. It's a good call out, and we should capture it in the document. It's not in there right now, but I think the thing, what people have in mind is that there is at any given time there is a single hub to which the room is home. So there's a room does not have multiple hubs, and that the hub is not simply a blind forwarder, but it is also acting as a policy control point as well. I think this was, as I recall, a point of discussion at the Mimi meeting at IETF, where I think we said that the hub establishes the policy envelope. That phrase is in the document. So the hub establishes the policy envelope, and then the clients and servers participating in the room can contribute to the precise policy. I think the document also says that all of the servers have a common synchronized, up to some boundary view of what the policy is, which means that any of the servers can act as a policy control point.
Right. So I guess the reason I'm, right. Well, can independently enforce the policy, but that right. I guess the part of why I'm asking is if it's possible, for instance, for hubs to move, then for communication with a hub, then this point here about this last major bolt on the slide may have a real problem in this. That maybe if A and B are not willing to talk directly, then the hub cannot move to B because it's bad news, right? So I think it will be important to establish quite early. So I think this is a good design choice, but I think that it has some consequences, and I think one of them is that portability becomes more difficult. And I'm perfectly fine with not having portability, but others may not be. So I just wanted to flag that.
Yep, and to be clear, I think that folks do have in mind that ultimately we will need some portability mechanism like that so that the hub can move. But yeah, you're totally right that it does have this consequence.
Well, right, but I guess what that means is that you'll then need a mechanism. You'll then potentially need to elect a new hub, not just have one stand up, right? And you say, so you might, I mean, so like, like the sort of implied structure of the current system, I understand it, is like that with roughly the initiator, the first initiator of the chat becomes the hub, right? And sort of you might imagine saying, well, that like you just rank order people by like entry into the room, and like if you know the garbage collect the hub, and like that may not work in this situation, right? And so, and in fact, it may be possible in this situation. If you're willing, I guess what I'm saying is, if you think that if you think it's a non-requirement that every server is willing to talk to every other server, then it may be the case that a room can decay to the point where it can no longer be possible to have it work. Because if you say hubs are garbage collected when there's no longer going to be on them, and not everybody, you don't have a full mesh of communication, then it could be possible that like when the last person from service A leaves, service C leaves, like the communication just falls apart, even though A and B are still in the room. And so that's not undesirable outcome. And so I just wanted to flag that. So like, so it may be more complicated than one thinks.
Yes, no, I agree.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, you know, multiple ways that these things can resolve, right? Like, hopefully, you know, in an ideal world, like we wouldn't actually, you know, we could design to accommodate these reachability problems, and they may not materialize in reality.
Yeah.
Maybe there's, you know, that there's a community of servers out there that's sufficiently large, and everyone's willing to talk to one another within that space, and so portability just works. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of kind of build it and see how it works.
I'm happy to for this for a while. I just wanted to like make sure we had these things in our mind.
Yep, noted. Yeah, Basil?
And it might be controversial, but we can also live in a world where hubs don't move, right? Like that might not be a bad design choice, where basically server C owns the room forever.
I think that is certainly what we will build first, because I think just practically, I think the portability stuff is scheduled behind getting the thing working. So certainly the world we will build first, we'll at least define standards for first, will be a world in which the hub doesn't move. Now, as Ecker points out, you might have all the server C users leave, and then maybe you're relying on server C's charity. Maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need portability, but I think that's a question for a bit down the line. Travis, did you have a comment? I saw you pop up and back.
Sorry, unmuting. It probably takes 30 seconds. No, you answered it as part of your speech there.
Cool. All right, I think we can move to the next slide now. So so we're kind of trying to build up a model of how the protocol works. So you need to know what, we said rooms are the organizing concept. So you need to know, what are you going to do with the room to know what does the protocol need to do. One thing the protocol doesn't need to do is create rooms. I think, as Ecker pointed out, there's an assumption that we should document clearly that wherever the room is created is the hub for that room. But I think folks agree that the creation of a room is not something that you do using a MIMI protocol, because when a room is created, it's between whichever user created the room and its local provider. And so the mechanism to create the room is local to that provider. And so because MIMI is about inter-provider relationships, we don't need any protocol to do it. Now the caveat to that is that when you create a room, it's going to initialize the room with some stuff. It's going to make some initial crypto state, some initial policy state, and you're going to ultimately need to share that with other providers who are going to participate in the room after its creation. So there will be protocol results. The state that the protocol thinks and talks about will get initialized by this creation operation, but there's no kind of message that is sent in the protocol to accomplish the operation. Ecker?
Yeah, I forgot I was still on the screen. That's amazing. So your assumption is that a room is created only has one person in it then, in the default case.
Or yes, or I mean, the bullets I've laid out here would also be compatible with creating a room with only users from a single provider.
Yeah, quite so. Yes, right. But
so if like you, me, and Martin Thompson had a room on WhatsApp, and we wanted to add, Rowan on wire, we might kind of promote that provider native room into a MIMI room.
Agreed.
And, yeah.
Right. But if I was on WhatsApp and you were on wire, then the order of operations is I create an empty room, or not empty, a room size 1 in WhatsApp, and then add you on wire, right? So this is like an MLS question. Can MLS groups only have exactly one member?
Oh, in fact, that is the only way that an MLS group is ever created, is that you initialize a 1-member group with yourself, and then you add people to it.
I guess that's true. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I guess I keep thinking of it as you create it by instantiate by adding the new person, but you're quite right. Okay, then that seems fine.
Yep. But yeah, that may be something to document more clearly. Is that the assumption is that this the initial population of the room is local to a specific provider, and then in other users local to other providers can then be added to the room. And I don't think it really matters whether it's one person within that provider or multiple users. I think this seems plausible. This promote a provider local group to an interoperable group thing actually seems like a plausible use case if providers are gonna use the MIMI stuff for interoperating stuff and not for their local stuff. So seems plausible. Okay, so creation, no protocol for that, but it has it initializes the state. Messaging is kind
sorry,
of
Richard.
Simple. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Mallory's in the queue. Before you move on.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't looking at the queue.
Oh, I think perhaps that was Mallory. Do you want to ask a question?
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. Thank you. Yeah. Before we move on, I think it is important to define this, but it could maybe happen later. I just see a real problem with often what happens, say, with people who often are communicating with one another is that they go to their chosen app and then they add in the people they want to talk to, whether or not they have an open group chat. And it would be a vastly different experience if the person initiating, let's say that 3-way example you used, if the person who initiated the message changed then the room, or it would just be that you would have multiple different rooms. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I think that this should be really well defined. I also see some providers as maybe having reason to, or mechanisms that they could devise ways to play with the protocol such that they were always the host. And maybe that would be an advantage, and that could be a competitive edge. So I think the protocol and the specification should consider that a potential vector and try to tighten it up. Thanks.
Yeah, fair point. And I think if we have this invariant that it's the creator of the room that is the hub, that kind of avoids the gaming point that you brought up later. But obviously that will come back up if we have a hub portability protocol later on. With regard to kind of opening your preferred app and adding people, I think there's a little bit of a separation here between the user experience and the protocol operations. I think you could have a user experience where I open up, say, WhatsApp, I add, my friend Alice who's on Wire, my friend Bob who's on Wicker, and just hit start up the group chat. I think that's compatible with then under the hood, my client creating a room local to my provider and then adding those users on other providers to the room. So just because we say add, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a user visible add operation.
That makes a lot of sense, but it would be frustrating if a week ago those same people were talking and Alice had created the room last week. And that means you're in 2 different rooms now with the same people because Alice and you are on different providers. And so you have different rooms. That's all I'm trying to say, is that is often a very common, in my experience anyway, it's a really common mode of user operations, and that could just lead to a lot of confusion.
Yes, although I understand the confusion and the frustration, I'm not sure how well it's going to be feasible to maintain uniqueness of anything across providers. Raphael?
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, I think it's a very important point, but I think providers are capable of achieving any kind of UX they desire in that instance. They could, as you said, Richard, promote an existing room from an MLS perspective, there's no reason that would stand against that. If they want to instead clone a room and have a different group, they could also do that. So, but from the protocol perspective, both are possible. So it's not prohibitive in any way, I think.
Okay, cool. All right, so that's creation and ownership. Like I was saying, messaging is kind of the next simplest thing, in that the messaging is presumed to be end-to-end encrypted. So the actual contents of the messages are only going to be accessible to the clients, which is why we have a messaging format draft that's already adopted that says what the contents of those messages are. So at a certain level, the servers are really just forwarding things. And it follows this pattern where the user submits a message to their origin server, the origin submits it to the hub fans it out to everybody else who's in the room. So basically the hub needs to know all the servers who are involved, the servers need to know which of their users are involved in the room. Now, as we discussed a few points up, the other thing that servers can do in addition to forwarding messages is apply authorization policy. So I think we are assuming that it will be visible to the servers who is sending a message. And so an aspect of the authorization policy that one could imagine is whether a given user is authorized to send messages into the space or merely receive. And so that sort of policy can be applied even outside of the envelope, as long as you can see who the sender is. So we will need a message forwarding protocol, but it's a fairly straightforward one. The more interesting question here, ironically, we just sort of the actual thing we're trying to do, the messaging, the cool stuff, we kind of push off to the side. So yeah, that's straightforward. We'll get to it. And then let's focus on how we maintain the state of the room. So obviously, a room is going to have some state associated to it, aside from just the messages that are sent in it. It's going to have some end-to-end encryption state, the keys and credentials that are involved in a group. At least the public bits will be known to the server. The private bits will obviously be private to the clients. It'll have authorization policy. You can imagine consent things that would be attached to it, and et cetera. So I'll get into some of the details of the state, but broadly speaking, it's the job of the servers to collaborate in the maintenance of the state. I think it's probably accurate to say that the hub is the authoritative source of the state, and other servers may suggest things. Clients may also suggest changes to, say, the authorization policy. So proposals for changes come into the hub maintains it, and then maintains a synchronized view of the state across all the servers. And obviously synchronized is a little fraught because time is different in different places, relativity is being what it is. But some notion of synchronicity, I think the idea is to maintain some notion of sync across all of the servers. And so I think that a lot of the where the design team has been discussing and where there's continued work going on is elaborating what this state is and how these maintenance operations go on. So I have more on that on the next slide. But I think these are the high level kind of operations that go on in the life of a room, and just the high level jobs that the servers participating in a room need to do. Next slide, please. So now turning a little bit to look at the protocol stack and kind of how we accomplish those jobs. As we said above, the MIMI protocol is either server to server or client to client. So the stuff that is not end-to-end encrypted is server to server, and the stuff that is end-to-end encrypted is client to client. And we've this is like a few days old. We've only had a little bit of discussion about this model that's on the slide, but we've got kind of a three-chunk taxonomy of protocols. So obviously there's a messaging protocol. We'll have a message forwarding thing that the servers do. We'll have the message encapsulation and formats. The formats we already have. So there's messaging, which, like I said, is pretty straightforward. Closer to the servers and more directly in between the servers is this idea of control. So this goes to the job of maintaining the state of the room. So the idea is that the word we use for the kind of sub protocols that manage the room state are control protocols. I think I've got some more detail on that on the next slide. And then all of this unfolds over some transport protocol that actually facilitates the communication among servers. Yeah, Eric.
This diagram and this control line, like the hub is actually involved in that, right? So yeah. That looks like it's hopping over the hub, but that's just a diagram problem, right?
Yeah. I probably haven't gotten like the SVG generation quite right.
Yeah.
I've gotten really good at drawing the brackets, but like,
but the mechanic is what I'm supposed to be taking home. The mechanics is that the control messages are conceptually end-to-end between provider A and provider B, but they're also end-to-end between provider A and the hub. Is that correct? Is that what I'm supposed to be getting in mind, or even not end-to-end, or how's everybody thinking of this?
Yeah, we should.
Or are you going to get that in a minute?
Yeah, this diagram probably needs some iteration, because I think the framework probably sounds more like, I think, what I said on the last slide, where when a server is submitting proposals for changes, they get submitted to the hub over some control protocol, and then the hub distributes the changes to other servers in the room, so that they're up to date. Again, using a control protocol, but it has the same kind of fan outs pattern as like a messaging thing would.
Well, I guess that's what I'm getting at is it possible, for instance, for the hub to persuade, if we have A, B, and C, and B is the hub, is it possible for the hub to persuade C that A sent a particular message?
Yeah. So that is in fact on the next slide, where we talk about authentication.
I will sit down.
And again, I think the idea here is that in fact we should authenticate, authenticate messages according to where they originated. So if there is a change that is proposed by provider A, it is authenticated by provider A in a way that all of the other servers can verify it. And in fact, I think one of the active areas of discussion is whether we also do that at the client layer. So if Alice at provider A proposes a change, should it be attributable to Alice in a way that everybody in the meeting can authenticate? Good question. Travis?
Sorry, 30-second lag again. The control protocol as it's sort of described here, I know on the design team, we've been using some other words that may not be totally understood by the group here, but I just want to kind of confirm, is this what we've been previously calling signaling, or it, I guess, like handles some of the encryption, some of the user level stuff?
Yeah, so I think in my intent here was to have control encompass all of the different state management things. So control maybe more as sort of a layer encompassing a few different sub-protocols. So you might have, so we've been using the word signaling, I think, in the design team as in terms of things that control things like policy, things that control things like abstract membership, and then DS-like things that control the end-to-end state. I was viewing this control layer as encompassing both of those because they have kind of similar properties in terms of the way they flow, and the fact that they're both controlling aspects of the state. Raphael?
Yeah, just a quick interjection. You said earlier that it's still under discussion whether or not it should be clear to everybody when clients actually initiated something and signed something. So that, of course, is already the case for MLS, obviously, because those messages always originate from the clients and are signed by the clients and are visible to everyone along the route. So for that part of the protocol, that question is already answered.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Yeah, I think the question is how we propagate that out to potentially other aspects of the protocol. Matthew?
I just had a follow-on from Travis in terms of trying to understand the shift of signaling to control, which is absolutely fine in terms of terminology shift, but more kind of what the etymology is. I mean, should we be thinking of this like media resource control protocol stuff that kind of is sitting on top of other existing signaling protocols like SIP in order to orchestrate things, or is that coincidence, or did the word just come from kind of grasping for something that wasn't as confused as people were getting over what the word signaling means?
Yeah, you know how terminology stuff goes. You know, one word gets tainted and you move on to the next one. I think the concept here, we had the discussions in the design team about there being some data structure associated to the room that captured the room's state. And so I think the how I arrived at the control here was that like what all these protocols have in common, both end-to-end stuff, policy stuff, whatever other types of state we're managing, those are all like taking a data structure that's associated to the room and updating it somehow. And they all have this kind of you know, people propose changes and they get distributed shape to them. So trying to draw out commonalities, you know, as you know, the commonality that they're all kind of manipulating the state.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So basically, control manipulates state, messages sends actual messages, and the state that you control with the control protocol could be encryption state, or it could be metadata about the room, or it could be the membership of the room, or the policy of the room, etc. Sounds great.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, it's kind of like the state events versus other events taxonomy in Matrix, and you know, there's analogous things in some other protocols. Yeah, just trying to find the right set of words for this crowd. I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so working through this kind of from the bottom up. Now I've included some fixed width font stuff on the left-hand side, just like totally notionally, this is not how you would actually do it. But the idea of, you know, I think the functionality we're trying to wrap up in this transport, we've in the design team folks have been calling kind of a thick transport or chunky transport, because it's not just delivering bytes, it's not just a dumb pipe. The idea here is to basically provide an authenticated eventing framework that the control and messaging layers can use. So define, you know, a way that you say what an event is, a way that you authenticate who sent that event, and then also, yes, the physics of how you get that event from one server to another. So if you look at the protocols that are out there, some of the predecessors that we discussed in July, you know, this is kind of like the PDU framework. You know, Matrix has these PDUs that are assigned by their origins, and these transactions that pass the PDUs around. The MIMI-DS protocol had these DS requests that were signed and went across. So the idea is to kind of capture that functionality in this layer. And I believe in our last call, Conrad and Travis were going to kind of sit down and take a look at some of the ideas from MIMI-DS and some of the ideas from Matrix, and see what the right kind of combination was. But yeah, the idea is, as you can see on the left, is like have some, you know, probably HTTP, maybe we'll fold in WebSockets here, some physics of how this gets from one server to another. And then within that, have kind of an event type framework that determines what else is in the message, and have some signing modality that authenticates the origin. Rowan.
Would you characterize that as an existence proof rather than an endorsement that you should go and do it that way?
Sorry, are you talking about my example here, or the message that's being sent?
Well, certainly the example that you gave, but like, would we be specifying, you know, do you see that we would be specifying an example, or like there would be another document that describes, you know, like not the architecture document, but like the document that defines control or defines some signaling things, would have a concrete way to go and signal this stuff? But
oh yeah, absolutely. So I think the idea of the transport protocol would be, so when I say the transport protocol, I mean some other document, not the architecture, that I think some combination of Raphael, Travis, Conrad, et cetera, will be writing, will define all of these bits, and define, you know, at least a way to do that the other layers of the stack will assume. Matthew?
So question about the signatures at the transport layer. Are we worried at all about this causing compatibility problems for deniability in future in terms of proving unequivocally what device originated some given message, and then all the various blackmail problems associated with that. And yes, I appreciate that deniability is a fraught subject, and somebody with a SGX attested client can go and potentially break the deniability by proving what they saw at the time that a conversation happened. But from a purely practical perspective, we're at least aware of an awful lot of users who care a lot about, if nothing else, the box ticking exercise of saying that a given protocol is deniable, and slapping signatures everywhere which locks everything to a given user or a given device, at least on the matrix side, has been seen as a no-no historically.
Yeah, so if folks like deniability, they're going to be sad with really quite a bit of of the cryptographic architecture here, because MLS is all based on signature. There's been some very preliminary thinking on how to design a deniable flavor of MLS, but right now it's all signature based. So I think the baseline here will be that not much is going to be deniable. Right, whenever you send a message, certainly it will not be deniable because it'll have a signature that everyone else can validate. So the incremental thing here would be whether things that users send are attributable at the transport layer as well, even state management things in addition to messaging. I hope it's uncontroversial. So I think the signature here is intended to encompass certainly server authentication. And in fact, client authentication is probably an interior aspect to this, because you'll want the server to attest that it was processing one of its users' messages. So I would hope it was uncontroversial to authenticate the servers in who are participating in the room.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, obviously want to authenticate the servers, but you can almost argue it's a feature if you end up having to trust the server to claim the traffic on behalf of its users, such that from a deniability perspective, a user could always claim that the server was spoofing their traffic. However, if we're basically putting it out of scope for MIMI because MLS already effectively has it out of scope, then I mean, that would make sense almost just by extension, if nothing else. I just wanted to check.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think what I meant to say is, like, MLS is going to make at least the messaging non-deniable. So, like, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should not have non-deniable authentication in other parts of MIMI, but it does mean that the value of that deniability would be less.
Okay.
Eric?
I think this is like conceptually fine. Conceptually is about all we can say at this moment. I just wanted to flag that that it's implicitly importing a new concept, which is of a server identity infrastructure, right? And you may just say, well, we're going PKI, which may be fine, but like at the moment, until this moment, the only concepts we had were the web PKI for TLS and some sort of unspecified identity architecture for users, and this implies identity architecture for servers as well. I think that's probably fine, and I think it probably can be the web PKI, but I just want to make sure like everybody remembers that's the case.
Yeah, it's a good thing to flag, and we discussed it a little bit in the last design team call. I think the good news is that everyone, at least on that call, agreed that the servers have domain names. So in principle, you could apply the web PKI to the problem. But
yeah, I think that'd be fine. And I think I'm sure there'll be some complaining about how it's not actually
not TLS,
being used for the EKU, but I think
you're violating my EKUs. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure we could certainly do, the well-known hack if we had to, right? So.
Yeah, Giles?
I do think that is going to be important with certain very important players and who might be adopting this. Not Google especially, but and I'm wondering if designing this around group level signatures, if that's the right term. So like you have a key that authenticates you as a legitimate member of the group rather than you as an individual. Like maybe that's something that we should design optionally into this. And I don't know if that's compatible with MLS as well, but
no, in fact, I think it's enabled by MLS because MLS's whole job is to synchronize keys across all of the clients. And so if you can derive a key
right.
pair from that, then you can very easily do a group signature. So it's not a crazy idea.
Yeah, so I think that's a good compromise because you know you need authentication, but sometimes authentication as just as a member of the group is enough.
Yeah, the trade-off would be the granularity at which you could apply policy. So if you're going to try and apply, say, you know, policy on whether you could send, then you wouldn't have authenticated user identity to apply that policy.
Right, but I think having that at least as an option would go a long way to satisfying deniability deniability hawks.
Fair enough. All right, Jonathan.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. So just to be clear, this signature is signed by the server and not the end user, right? Like this is not the MLS signatures, right?
Yeah, so I should have been a little clearer on this slide. I think probably what we want is actually two signatures, a signature from, well, again, modulo the other conversation, a signature from the user that originated an event. So if I send a message, or if I'm sending a proposal to, you know, grant Bob permissions, I should sign that message myself, and then my server should also sign it as originating from that server.
Okay, so let me talk about the latter, which is the server signatures, which I am unconvinced we need in this protocol. And the reason is that we have this notion that there's a hub, right, which is the central point through which everything flows. And you could use just plain old MTLS to allow the hub to know who the followers are, and for the followers to know who the hub is. The only reason that would be, and then we'd be done. Like we don't need anything else. The only reason I can see that you'd want signatures here is you think that there are authorization decisions that a follower will make about another follower, independent of the decisions that the hub has made. And I can't imagine what those decisions would be. I mean, so if the hub has made a decision to accept the message, do you really want the follower to independently say, oh, I don't, you know, yeah, it's signed, it's valid, but my authorization policy says even though the hub accepted it and sent it to me, I'm going to reject it? It doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't know what decision making you would make off of this signature, and therefore, why do you need it?
I can give a specific example if folks don't mind me jumping the queue.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so claiming key packages and obtaining user level consent are both activities that may require one follower to obtain this from another follower through the hub. And it's very useful in both of these cases to know what is the origin, you know, what is the origin follower.
And the decision would be made by the follower, not the end user, you're saying, Ron?
Sorry, the mute is taking a long time. The follower, the follower is the one that's originating the message because the end user is potentially using their own native protocol in order to do this. So there's, you know, you're translating from, say, the WhatsApp protocol, the client clicking on, I want to do a, you know, I want to set up a one-on-one connection with Rowan at Wire, and I'm using my own protocol on my server, and this message needs to originate from the provider, go through the hub provider, which might be, you know, Google or Matrix or something, and then go to the other follower provider. And by the way, these are, a lot of these are written in these scenarios are listed in the draft MIMI transport design requirements document.
I understand the use case. I'm saying I still don't know why you need the signature per se, which is there's two followers here, right? There's the one that originated the connection request and then the one that received it. The one that received it, like, why do they need to? I'm not saying they don't need we need to know who the originating user was that sent the connection request. There's no dispute on that, because the recipient receiving the connection request has to make a decision, yes or no, right? But the hub is going to already authenticate and authorize the follower that sent the connection request. And so if that was invalid, it would have dropped it. It didn't, it forwarded it to the receiving follower. Why does the receiving follower need to authorize that this has not been tampered with? As if it was, the hub would have rejected it. That's the part I don't understand. Like, it doesn't feel like it's adding another layer of useful security.
Yeah, I guess it's my turn anyway. So I think I can speak to that. If we just go back a little bit, I'll first answer Giles' concern, and then I go back to that. Because usually it's me who ends up speaking when it comes to deniability, so today is not going to be an exception. So I think the question Matthew brought up is really interesting, and I hadn't given it a lot of thought in the context of federated messaging at a server-to-server layer, essentially. This is also new in the sense that typically deniability is something that exists between users and not in federated messaging so far. So that's definitely new territory. So yeah, as Richard clarified, the signatures we are talking about on this slide, they are server-to-server. So whether or not we need deniability at that level, the whole new question. My gut feeling is we don't need it, and it's going to be weird, but let's see. Happy to discuss. For the signatures used in MLS, in the vanilla core protocol, there is no deniability. As Richard already pointed out, we are looking into how we can improve that for those who want it. And I'm also aware of this one gatekeepers requirement there. And that is sort of disconnected from the transport in the sense that it's a different kind of authentication, that it's really end-to-end. It could be tainted by the transport, of course, because then the transport gives you some proof that a message has traveled between two servers at least, but not necessarily between two users. So yeah, that's something that is not completely impossible. But yeah, this is also the place where I say it would be great if the folks who want deniability speak up and say so on the record. Now, going back to Jonathan's question here, the whole motivation for the signature was that between two servers, meaning a follower and a hub, or a hub and the next follower, the idea was to have mutual authentication. And one way of achieving that, of course, is to do MTLS. There were reservations for that specifically, simply because it's hard to do in Google scale environments. You don't get your hands on the private key used for TLS so that you can do the other part of the authentication. So the proposal here is to have the leg between follower and hub authenticated one way through TLS and the other way through a signature. So every request is essentially originating from the follower, would then be signed as a counterpart. And that is what Matrix is also doing. So this is the starting point. Whether that's going to be the final design is a different question. There are some concerns about how that can scale, that are definitely valid. But the starting point is to have a mutual authentication that happens through two different mechanisms.
Ecker?
Yeah, so I had not processed the thing Raphael just said, and I think that is a very, very bad idea. I think it's going to create. I think having things which are authenticated only in one direction, and then relying on the signatures on the thing carried above them to provide authentication somehow, implicit authentication of the connection seems bad. Remember, the signatures aren't probably confidentiality for the data. So like, unless this is done very carefully, we can have a situation where we've authenticated one side of the connection, but you're talking to the attacker, and the attacker has basically initiated connections in both directions, and he's now proxying back and forth. And he can't inject anything, but he can see it. So people should bite the bullet and do MTLS. Not try to work around it with something at the layer above. Because it's going to be very hard to talk about intelligently about and reason about the security properties of the system if we don't do that. So I'm sorry if that's unfortunate, if that's inconvenient, but like people should do that. And if they don't want to do that, then we should do a channel binding or something else that binds the connection. What we should not do is use signatures not necessarily, maybe not, Jonathan. Channel binding is the appropriate technology here, really. But in any case, what we should not do is use signatures as a way to avoid MTLS. I'd assume the purpose of this exercise was to distinguish between actions initiated by someone who's not the hub on the other side of the hub and the hub, right? So as a concrete example, say that a user that B is the hub and a user of C reports a message is abusive sent by someone from A, and it wants to get propagated back to A. We don't want the hub being able to pretend that something was abusive when it actually was reported as abusive by user C when it was not. That's what I understand the purpose of this exercise to be. If we don't think any of those situations are relevant, then maybe we can get away without the signatures. But I'd assume the situation was we want to distinguish between, as I said, things initiated by the hub and things initiated by the leaves.
All right, so I got to interject here with the chair programming note. Now we're at the end of the scheduled hour for the architecture discussion. However, as Alyssa said at the top of the session, we do want to have this discussion, reach its conclusion today. So what we're going to do is move Ecker's presentation from the second hour on discovery requirements to the next interim that we'll have to make more room to discuss architecture. But we still intend to get to the remainder of the user discovery stuff. Okay, so with that, I'll reopen the queue so we can pursue discussion of this current topic. Thanks.
I was hoping we could wrap up the transport topic because that was the easy slide. So thank you, Tim, and Chairs for the extra time, because we can definitely fill it. So I think that I appreciate the discussion on the transport stuff. I think that's a lot of good input. I suggest we kind of take that back to the design team and digest a little bit and come back with revisions. So let's go on to the next slide, which is about kind of these control protocols and what those might look like. So yeah, the idea as suggested above is that if you look at a room, it's going to have a few types of state that are mostly independent from each other, and mostly we'll get into a little bit in the slide. The next one, right? At least end-to-end encryption state, which clients have the keys to decrypt, and authorization policy, which users and which servers are allowed to do things in the context of the room. So those are pretty distinct types of state. MLS does a lot to do end-to-end encryption state, does nothing for policy. There's some good policy management stuff in Matrix and related protocols that just operates entirely independent of end-to-end encryption. So the kind of the concept here is that for each type of this state, MIMI should define a corresponding control protocol that does the stuff that is needed to manage that state. So on the end-to-end encryption side, you'll have objects you'll send via the transport to go and fetch a key package from another provider via the hub. You'll have events you send to add and remove clients for users who are participating in the room, things like that. On the policy side, there'll be some event that articulates the creation of the room with its initial policy. There'll be something that declares the policy envelope for the room that the hub sets, and then there will be proposals to modify this policy as the room evolves. So to grant capabilities, deny capabilities, things like that. So the idea is that we'll have kind of these parallel sub protocols I've been thinking of that use the transport to move around but manage kind of independent types of the room state. And this left-hand example is kind of an example of one of the things you might see in end-to-end encryption control protocol, where Alice on provider A is requesting a key package for Bob so she can add him to the room. and it's signed obviously in one of the controversial ways. But the idea is that the control protocol within this overall inventing framework, the control protocol would define a certain slice of event types, would define the internals of what goes in the message, what goes in the events, and things like that, so that it would have enough types of events and enough information in those events to get done whatever jobs it needs to do for managing the state it's in charge of. So I've got some more controversial stuff on the next slide, but any questions or comments on this kind of general approach? Yeah, Alyssa.
Yeah, I wanted to see if we still have the notion of sort of like 2 levels of policy. When you talk about the policy envelope, that's like, this is the span of policies that could be applied to this room, and then you have a protocol that the hub uses to communicate what that is set at initially, and then the followers to adjudicate whether they want to make changes to it. And then you have a lower level policy, which is specifically like, this user is allowed to do these actions in this room. And again, the followers talk to each other about the specifics. Is that
Yeah,
at the taxonomy?
I think we still have that. That's I believe in the section of the architecture doc that discusses the policy control protocol, that notion of the envelope versus the specific policy is still there.
Okay.
Yep. So one thing to note about the way I'm describing this here is that there's a control protocol for each type of state, because the types of state are mostly orthogonal to each other. Basically, it's up to the servers and the clients participating in the room, when there's overlap between these 2 types of state, to make sure that the 2 types of state remain consistent. And one way that shows up pretty immediately when you start looking at this is the notion of membership in terms of clients and end-to-end encryption state, and any non-cryptographic notion of membership or permission at the user level. In particular, on the next protocol, on the next slide, please. So something that has has kind of emerged as an interesting point in the design team discussions is this question of whether you can be a member of a room in some meaningful sense without having any clients that are part of the end-to-end encryption state. Iker, should I go on, or do you want to interject there?
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so the way you kind of arrive at this question is that, if you look at the end-to-end state of the room, like an MLS group, like when you look at that end-to-end state, you can see which clients are, have access to the keys. You can see which user each client belongs to. And so you can get a notion of which users are in the room based on who has the keys. So the question is, like, is this the only notion of user level membership? So there's a notion. At the same time, you can also imagine independently managing some notion of user level membership, so that, like, I can add Ecker to the room in advance of doing anything with regard to end-to-end cryptography. He could have no devices. I've never known him to be that, without devices, but it's in principle possible that Ecker could have no devices alive at a given moment. And so there's no way to join him to the end-to-end encryption state, but I can still kind of mark him as someone who's in this room, who has capabilities in this room as part of the policy. And so there's a question whether we also have that that notion of user level membership that's not derived from cryptographic, having some clients join to the room. There's arguments on both sides of this. So in favor of having an independent notion of membership, there's this idea that, like, if I'm a paranoid web user and I, log in and use my web client for some time, and then I just delete all of my browser state, all of my private keys go away, and I leave the end-to-end encryption state. Like, if I do that repeatedly, that's how I interact with the room. The other clients shouldn't have to be bothered with all of that. They should just see that I am, persistently part of this. That's one argument. On the other side, if you don't have a client joining the room, especially if we have this notion of user level signing that we discussed in the transport context, then you can't actually do anything in the room. So certainly you can't read messages if you're not part of the end-to-end encryption state. Maybe you can't even like sign a policy message to say, you know, I should join someone else. So if, especially in that case where we're signing messages from users, there's really not, the only thing you can really do if you don't have any clients already joined is join a client and then take some action. And what I'll propose finally before we start processing the queue, as a possible middle way here, I think that maybe the word membership is a hang up, speaking as we were earlier of tainted words. It seems like the thing that folks have in mind when they talk about non-cryptographic notions of membership is really like things about which we have policy. You know, we already I think have pretty good agreement that there is a need for a policy protocol independent of the end-to-end encryption, right? Because end-to-end encryption protocols don't do policy, and so maybe the closest thing we have to membership outside of cryptography is this idea that like this user appears as a subject in the policy. So the example here, like if I don't have any clients joined, I'm not an active participant, I'm not a member, if we're going to use that word, of the room. But if I do show up, one of my clients does show up, it has these capabilities. It's allowed to add people, but not to send messages, etc. So like maybe that's a close enough notion to map onto some of the precedents, but just thought I'd throw it out there. So that'll open the queue, Ecker.
Yeah, so I think before we talk about mechanism, let's talk about policy for a second, or use cases. So I think that the use case that I think, here are two use cases I think are important to some degree or another. One is, one is if I lose all my devices, I should be able to like come back in the room without having some, and that should happen automatically, right? That should not require some person to be involved in re-adding me. So like I think that's one. I think perhaps less. It should also be the case to add somebody, with them being offline, right? And I think it needs to such that if they come, such that when they come online, it works properly. Now, as I understand it, in MLS is sort of somewhat ambiguous notion of membership, which is to say that there's a sense in which in which I can read messages, but I'm not actually part of the group because I haven't sent my own update. And there was a bunch of material about that in the architecture document that I was like, I had to work through people. So I think that's perhaps a less important a thing, but just this liminal state where you're like actually you're not officially in the group, but you actually are in the group. But I think the most important thing, like I say, is that once someone is added to the group, and by someone I mean a human, not like a piece of software and not a device, they should continue to be in the group by having other people muck around. And so I don't like, I can imagine 8 different ways of doing that, but I think, and this may be a fine one, but I think that's a requirement. If you think that's not a requirement, we should hear that now, because it would simplify things dramatically if we didn't have to solve that problem.
I mean, that makes sense to me. Rowan?
Hello?
Yep, gotcha.
Yeah.
I hear you fine.
So I agree that you need to be able to have somebody who was a user who was added and then deletes all their clients, that they need to be able to have another client go and join later. And I don't think that is membership. I think that is authorization. They are pre-authorized to go, that user is pre-authorized by virtue of the fact that they were added once. So I think by keeping these notions separate, I think we get exactly the properties that we want, and we don't have this confusion about what a member is. And furthermore, having been through quite a few discussions with multiple uses of the word member, I don't think we should be using membership or the word member to be describing anything to do with rooms or users. I think since we have a concept of membership, of a member in an MLS group, that should be reserved for that in order to avoid even the possibility of confusion. And that we have another perfectly good word, participants, which we could use for people who are active, people who have users who have clients of whatever end-to-end encryption variety that they want that are in the appropriate end-to-end encrypted messaging.
So Rowan, let me ask a question real quick about your pre-authorization notion, which I think clearly, one of the things someone who is in the room, as Ecker pointed out, someone who is in the room and has lost all of their devices should be able to should be pre-authorized to add new devices. But I think a corollary to Ecker's point about durability of being in the room would be that any policy notions about like what I'm allowed to do should also be durable. So would your notion of a pre-authorized, authorized to add clients user be compatible with like also having policy about that user?
Yeah, and exactly what is written in draft May group chat, draft May MIMI group chat, like everything that's written there is consistent with that, including using the term pre-authorization, including the blob that's defined there. Now, I think that I tend to have this notion of policy as being a very narrow thing. Not that Richard is an admin, but an admin is allowed to do this and go consult whatever list that you have, however you got that, to figure out who is an admin. I also want to point out that it's quite possible that you could have a user that has permission to ban other users from a room, even if they're not a participant in the room. It's somebody who could get like a third-party IAM and say, "Hey, this person is being abusive. Like, could you please ban them?" They don't need to have any clients inside in order to do that. So I think membership is a very poor term to use to describe people who can do things or are described as having some role or relationship to a room.
Matthew?
Okay, I'm trying to follow this. So we're saying that I'm wondering if this whole explosive material thing might just be a terminology gap in the end, maybe, possibly. So Rowan, you're saying that participant is okay as a way to describe users who might not have devices in a room because they could be pre-authorized members, or
I think Rowan was trying to use participant for someone who does have a device joined, so they're an active participant.
Okay. And what was the proposed terminology then for somebody who doesn't have devices in the room because they've been invited or they've logged out of all their devices?
Pre-authorized user.
Okay. What would we expect the UX of this to be in a typical client connected into, speaking in a MIMI-backed room? If a user goes and logs out of all of their devices and they are converted from being a participant into a pre-authorized user, do they still appear in the roster, perhaps grayed out or something, or do they suddenly wink out of existence?
I mean, I think that's up to the implementation. They could be grayed out, or they could simply be dropped, and then someone who would, and then
or they could be displayed as normal, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could do it either way. I don't think that there's anything that any current behavior in any AM system that I know of that you can't do using this.
Okay, so it's basically saying rather than having a long-lived room membership thing that lasts for as long as that user is associated with the room, instead they flip-flop state between either being a pre-authorized user or a participant, depending on whether they're currently participating in the MLS group.
Yeah. Or whatever end-to-end encryption protocol it is.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for clarifying. I was just trying to understand that I was tracking. Hopefully, useful for other people too.
Okay. Raphael?
Yep. So I think Rowan said the most important bits already. I think it might also be helpful to try and dissociate what the potential UX is with the actual mechanism that we have at our disposal with MLS. Because we need to make this work first and foremost with MLS. And what Rowan proposes to have this pre-authorized list, or just a list, no matter what we call it, is exactly how that could work with MLS, meaning those users are not part of the MLS group, obviously, but it gives them the right to do an external commit into that group. And everybody will agree that they're allowed to do that and they will not reject that commit. And then we have those mechanics locked down, essentially. And the important bit here is that there is agreement among the group of who can rejoin the MLS group with that mechanism. And once we have that nailed down, then we can think about what the potential UX is. Do you display these users in the same way? Do you display them differently? That probably doesn't matter too much at the design time of the mechanism.
Ecker?
I'm going to swap with Jonathan because Jonathan actually should have been here before me, but like we have a shitty UI.
Yeah. All right. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So I think we're dancing around the word and we're getting confused about it. To me, this is not the way to think about this is in fact starting from the user experience. As a user in a messaging system, what's important to me is to know when I send a message, who could potentially see it, because it's important to me because I'm going to know how to craft that message, right? And so whether they currently have a valid client that has access to the key or whether they don't but could obtain one in the future is not that important at all from a user decision-making process. What matters is, might this person potentially see this message? And the answer is yes. And
what you just said is self-contradictory. Because if they don't have a client, then they won't be able to see it.
I think
Yeah,
Ecker's
John-
getting the queue, but
Yeah,
I
let's
think
follow.
Rowan is in the queue.
all right, Rowan can get in the queue and argue with me when I'm done making my point. So I think that this thing that we're calling a list of pre-authorized users is the roster as we would think about it, and it is important. Particularly, it is important for that to live as a whatever we call it. I'm not arguing about the name, but I'm arguing that there is this piece of state that is going to be maintained by the hub and synchronized out to the clients that answers the question, who are the set of people who currently will potentially see messages sent right now into this room? And I think it's important for us to recognize that that exists as a piece of state that is facilitated by this protocol. In addition, it did being used for policy purposes, right? We want to want the hub to say, oh, right now my policy is that, Rowan is blocked. Right? He's still in the room, but he can't send messages. So this is obviously going to require that the hub have some notion of who people are and be able to look at lists. So this is all in scope, in my view, for the responsibility of the hub. Thank you.
Like, I think the key question, as Jonathan says, is what is the user expectation of what happens to the messages they send? And there's a cryptographic sense in which at this exact moment, like if I send the message to to the group which is not part of the group, he's not going to get it. I think there are at least two situations in which that might be confusing, right? One of which is various kinds of scroll back in which people backfill the data. That is not always available in every application, but it might be in some, and it's perfectly reasonable to think that that you might have scroll back for people who'd been pre-authorized the entire time, even if they weren't members. Exactly the scenario where scroll back is like most interesting, right? It's also the case that that there's a question of like how the user interface behaves, which I mean, we shouldn't be dictating user interface, but like there's a conceptual difference between like this person was in before with their machine, their device is out, and and now they're back in again, and this person is like someone I've never seen before that's now in the group, right? And if the behavior is that when someone is in this pre-authorized list and they send an external commit, they're just automatically joined. Then we have a race condition where I think I'm not sending, Richard's not part of the group, and then suddenly he is, and Richard gets a message, or there's retransmission, or any of these other things, right? Depending on the behavior, retransmission behaviors, how they are exactly organized, right? And so in those situations, I'd be expected. I want to know when some new person joins the group. And in particular, maybe I'm supposed to I have some real alerting about that, but I don't want to know when Richard gets a new phone. And so, I think these are potentially all workable from a user interface perspective, but I think this does tell us that there's some mechanism we need here, and then we have to give some pretty clear guidance to people who are building systems that use this, that so they don't screw it up and produce like undesirable user interface consequences. Whatever that guidance, like this is a complicated concept, and so like if we're gonna have this, if we're gonna like actually imply that, if we're gonna use a bunch of words which are designed to suggest this person is not actually like in the group, I'm kind of avoiding the words we're using so far, then, and they're sort of like liminally in the group, then I think we have to like really be clear that you have to design your user interface to comport with that as well. Thank you.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left for Conrad, Rowan, and Alyssa, so please be brief. Conrad?
I think we should take as much time as we need on this, honestly.
Oh, okay.
We have
need more time
for the whole thing, and unless somebody wants to get in the queue and argue about it, I think this is higher priority than discovery.
For what this is the last content slide, so we can wrap up after we finish the queue here. So Conrad, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to briefly agree with Ecker that we should definitely give UI kind of guidance, or at least kind of be clear with our terminology here. At the same time, I just wanted to address two things. One is scrollback, and like that is we're probably going to have to discuss in depth, because as Raphael pointed out in the design team meeting, like there's one type of scrollback where you scroll back, you have scroll back between your own devices, the devices of a single user. So that should not be a problem, because at that point the user has one device in the group already, and so it's just a user, even on the MLS level. And the other situation is where the user does not have a client in the group, which is the situation where we're talking about. So that would require scrollback between users, and that is something that should be kind of visible and agreed upon on the group level. Or you have two users who are kind of weirdly colluding without it being part of the group configuration, then I guess that's a weird thing to do on an application level anyway. I'm not sure we can do anything against that, but yeah, so we should probably discuss that a bit more in depth in a different context. Another thing I want to suggest is that talking about user level membership is a bit tricky from a kind of, if you call the users members from a cryptographic standpoint, because what we probably don't want to suggest is that we have a user level membership that has some sort of cryptographic backing outside of MLS. I mean, if we wanted, we could create it, but that's kind of, that would open up a whole design space. And so kind of this having this pre-authorized notion of users that are allowed to do a very specific set of operations, such as rejoin, that probably works. But if we like really open it up for a user level interaction where the user can kind of, I don't know, do actions without being a part of the MLS group, and thus without kind of having key material to back it up, yeah, I'm a bit worried on how the solution would that look like for that, or the security guarantees more concretely.
Okay, Rowan?
Yep.
Roll back with users.
Alyssa?
Yeah, I just wanted Conrad to clarify what the meaning of scroll back between users is, unless it's clear to everybody else, but that was the part that I didn't understand. Scroll back between users. Okay, sorry, my bad if I didn't explain that correctly. So at least to me, there are two situations where you can have scroll back. One is where I have a device in the group, and I join into the group with a new device, and my other device gives me all the messages that have been passed in the group for some, maybe, I don't know, for some 100 messages or something, whatever the limit is there. And this is a kind of passing of messages from one of my own devices to another one of my own devices. So that's kind of user internal scrollback between two of the user's devices. And then you can have scrollback across users if there's a user who doesn't have a device in the group, but who might be pre-authorized. And then the user joins the group, and another user now goes and provides scrollback for that newly joined user. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Okay. This is like somebody who was in the MLS group initially sort of gifts you a certain amount of scroll back because now you're anointed as being part of the MLS group.
Exactly. And I mean, that's kind of dangerous because then users who
Yep,
have
yep.
sent messages in the past have no idea who they sent messages to at that point, except maybe if the user was pre-authorized, then that might work. But again, that's a UI question in the end, I think.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So Jonathan mentioned this idea of if the thing that most users care about is who will be able to receive a message if I send it right now. And so the default is that even if they're pre-authorized, but they don't have they're not in the MLS group, or they don't have, if we were using double ratchet, the same thing would apply if I didn't have any sessions set up, then you wouldn't be able to receive the message. And so saying that they are no longer an active participant, I think that is the right terminology, that is a very understandable set of terminology. There could be other good sets of terms for this, and saying that, well, because a user is pre-authorized, they might at any moment come in later and do this. I don't think that that's particularly compelling, because likewise, the race condition that Ecker described, it could be that a user adds another user, and that there's a race condition, which means that I start to send a message, but as the commit arrives, basically as I'm hitting the return key, and my client decrypts the commit and goes and sends a message in the new epoch to the new participant. Like, that's not a problem that Mimi is going to provide the answer to. And also this idea that we want to exclusively drive our protocol based on the user experience. This is not going to be 100% possible, because different popular messengers have different user experiences which are not consistent. You just have to look at how group DM works to see that it's not possible for us to do something that is going to be exactly the same guidance for every client. There are going to be some variations. So I think the terminology that I proposed works. I don't think it's the only one, but I think that it's well explained. And if you read the Mimi group chat, I think it explains how to do everything that I think that we want to do. And nobody has said, hey, I don't think you can do XYZ feature, or this such and such interaction works if you do it this way. Finally, the pre-authorization rules, they might not be just for a specific user. They could be for like a department or an entire domain name, right? And so we're not having the possibility that someone could go and inspect that, possibly using some separate user interface. That would be useful, but these features already exist now, where people who are not on the roster can join because by virtue of the fact that they're in a particular domain, or they're in somebody's contact list, or what have you, or they used a join link that they had. And so rosters can change quickly. And if you want a client that's going to inform you every time the roster changes, if you started composing before you sent, that's a feature that doesn't exist in any client at the moment, but it's a valuable feature. But we can't base our protocol and our terminology on a feature that we would like to have that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if this agrees with what you were saying or if it disagrees with it, but the part from what Jonathan said that I thought was very useful, and Ecker, is to sort of like match the protocol support to the entity that needs to act on it. So like, I do think it's probably the case, and I'm happy for people to disagree, that like, I really don't care if I'm in a group chat with a bunch of other people. I don't care how many clients they have, or like when they switch clients, and potentially I don't care when they get rid of all their clients either. What I care about, I think, as Jonathan was saying, is like whether they can read the messages or not. So that might just be useful as a demarcation point of like, what are we signaling to which, like at which level, based on who's going to actually act on the information that's being signaled. My question is, if we think about this pre-authorization state, is if you can only put yourself into it, or if it's possible for anybody else to put you into it, i.e., obviously, we want it to be possible for others to be able to kick you out of the MLS group, including other users and possibly other servers. But is it only the case that you put yourself into this pre-authorization state by not having clients in the room?
Alyssa, did you want me to answer the question or wait until my turn?
You or Richard, or you can, if you want to go with it.
Somebody else could add you to the pre-auth list. There are a bunch of use cases for that.
Why would they do that? Can you just give one or two? You mean
I went to go and add a user, but they didn't have any, but their server was down, and so I couldn't get their key packages. And then I know that I'm going offline for a couple of weeks, but I want them to be able to participate in the discussion. So I add that user from that other domain that's offline to my pre-authorization list for the room that I'm the admin of. And then when they come online, they can join without further, I could also say that joining via links is sort of a use case of this in the generic sense. And it's a very common joining, it's a very common way to join.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I was thinking of the other way around. Like if I'm in the group and I get reduced to the pre-authorization state, there's no equivalent of like kick or ban just down to this state. There's no like policy
delete all the
action that you would take to put somebody into this state. Yeah, exactly. Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. I think Mallory's next.
Okay. Yeah, I just before we move off of this and go into the discovery discussion, I just wanted to point out something that's still maybe bugging me is the right word about the assumption of this architecture where there is a host of a group, because I'm not sure that is the only choice, but it is the only choice we're talking about. And the more we talk about it, the more I'm seeing flaws with it. And so I'm certainly questioning that assumption. I obviously don't have an alternative necessarily to present right now, but I don't think we should necessarily take it as a foregone conclusion that this is the right direction. And I would just make one really, I guess, practical and so maybe not that important point, which is as far as the interoperability requirements of legislation like the Digital Markets Act, like group chats are a known hard problem, and they're not really, it's not actually required for quite a long time. So if folks that are going to be implementing something sooner rather than later, they're just implementing something between two people. And I know that we've identified that a group of one is still a room, or a group of two is still a room, and then a group of n plus whatever is still a room. It is definitely overkill when we talk about all these different features and all these different, which I agree with Rowan, do not need to be defined by MIMI. The features do not need to be defined. But then all the backend that would be ostensibly supporting that is pretty heavy for a two-person encrypted conversation. That's it.
Basil?
Should I go next?
Yep, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick thing about, I think it's useful for us to be able to track room membership separate from client membership and kind of keep that as a roster. I think there's kind of a lot of useful implications from not just from a user interface perspective, but I think, even though we're not thinking too much about it, but from a transitional perspective, that will make it a lot easier for people to move up and to be able to kind of get into an MLS state. So just something to kind of just keep in mind as we go through about this.
Matthew, go ahead.
Thanks. So the thing that is confusing me now on this is that we seem to be getting to the same end result, whether it's a user whose state is flip-flopping between being a pre-authed user versus a participant user, or if you just have a roster item with a user on it who has 0 or more than 0 devices. And it's really not clear to me why it's better to have this strangeness where the state of the user is either managed by the roster, presumably, if they're pre-authed, and then if they've got MLS devices, it's managed by MLS, and then they log out with their MLS devices and they pop back to being managed by the roster, rather than just having the user managed by the roster and the devices managed by the MLS group. This question goes to Rowan.
Hi. So I guess, first of all, I don't envision that once you're pre-authorized, that just because you become an active participant, that doesn't mean that you need to be removed from a pre-authorization list. So if you're added, you can be both an active participant and pre-authorized. There's no need for you to be not on a pre-authorization list just because you are already an active participant. It's only if you were, the only time that you could not be on a pre-authorization list would be if you were added as like a temporary user that was supposed to have an ephemeral connection.
That's very useful to know. Oh, sorry, Aaron, can I just very quickly check? Would you flag the pre-authorized users as different based on whether they've been invited into the room or whether they happen to be a user who is already participating in the room but doesn't have any devices?
I wouldn't make the distinction there. I think really it would only be if I had a type of, of invitation link or joining link that was intended for an ephemeral, one-time use, one-time single client use.
Okay, although semantically they are quite different in terms of, hey, I've tried to pull this user into the room, they haven't participated at all yet. They're not going to get any scroll back or anything, versus a user who was in the room who just happens to be switching devices or something. And as somebody, I think Conrad was mentioning earlier, they could collude out of band with another participant in the room, and the social contract would be fine for a participant in the room to share the messages that they missed whilst they were away, because semantically they were part of that conversation and they could have rejoined that conversation at any time. So to Jonathan's point, where there's effectively this race that any user could suddenly re-pop up with a valid device in the room, and you just don't know when that's going to happen. So everything you say, you have to say with the knowledge that that person might just spring back to life. Surely that's quite a different semantic state to invite.
But I think that the difference there is that if it's the policy that you have this collusion, that you'd want to be able to describe that. And like, for example, in Draft May Mimi group chat, there is a place that describes like logging history and things like that. And so if your history is logged, then you would know, even if the user isn't even if a particular user is or is not in a pre-authorized list, the fact that 10 seconds after you send an incriminating message about Carol, that Alice could go and invite Carol, and that she has the ability to go and do that scroll back, that's the thing that's more important, not whether Bob has any active clients, whether Bob is listed in the roster or not.
Yes, I understand.
So you could have Bob not in the roster. Yeah.
So I think you still semantically, though, need to distinguish between users who are invited, where the policy of the room may or may not say that it's socially acceptable to gossip, messages and scroll back for that invited user between participants. Now we have that in Matrix today. It's a join rule of either invited or shared history for invited or something else that basically says whether invited users are allowed to try to get at scroll back or not, versus a user which has accepted an invite, has been participating in the room and has disappeared again. And I strongly suspect that if we scratch the surface with more examples and edge cases, we'll find that it's almost safer to distinguish these two states. At which point, I think we're completely isomorphic with the original proposal of having roster track whether user is in the room or not, or invited to the room, and it is the same as your pre-auth state in the roster. And then completely separately, you've got MLS tracking what devices are in the room. So I think this might just collapse to pure terminology, sort of bike shedding in terms of whether you call these roster users pre-authorized or invited, or whether they are room members, or whatever word you choose to use for it. I mean, anyone feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but
yeah, that was the conclusion I was going to try and pull out of this. That a list of pre-authorized users sounds a lot like what other people were referring to as a roster. And I realized, I think, Rowan, you were just using roster to refer to the list of the MLS-derived list of users. But I think, as long as we're agreed,
encryption protocol derived list of users.
Sorry, yes, encryption protocol derived list of users. But I think it sounds like we have some commonality in the data structures we exist. Like there's a data structure you can derive from the encryption state. There's a data structure of pre-authorized or whatever that is managed some other how. And we just need to make sure that those things, we're clear about the words we use for those different things. Does that sound like an accurate, anyone have a difficulty with that characterization?
So I think the place where I disagree with Matthew here is that you could, if you have a bunch of specific features enabled, you could make this, make a roster collapse. You could make all the these concepts that I described collapse into a single roster, but not every client is going to go and support those features, and not every room is going to support scroll back. So in the case where they don't, then being able to distinguish that a user is going to get your, that from, in my terminology, that they're an active participant, I don't see how you get that information, or how you describe that state with the system that Matthew described.
I can try to jump in on that, right, Raphael? Or...
So let me try and manage the queue. Raphael, did you want to get in the middle here, or would you like to let Matthew go?
Go ahead, Matthew, if you want.
Okay, thanks, Raphael. I mean, to clarify, I'm wondering if we also were talking about the same thing with a roster. So I'll just say that you've got the non-cryptographically linked room state of the conversation, and I'm assuming that you invite a user, you go and put them in that room state saying this person has been invited, just like you might ban them, or even if they've never been associated with the room at all. They then join, they've got clients, they get added to the MLS group, everything's great. Later on, and I guess at that point you could change their state in the roster from invited to joined. In fact, that's the only difference, I think, in our models, that I'm proposing that you do update the roster at that point to say that they have actually accepted this invite, so that subsequently, as the user runs out of devices or switches device or whatever, they don't get mistaken for being an invited user, and that you just semantically differentiate between people who've been invited and haven't joined versus those who have joined but happen to have run out of devices. I think that is the only difference in the shape of our approach. I don't see any disadvantage to tracking that membership in two places effectively. At the control level or the room control level, they accepted an invite is a useful thing to know. And it's just totally semantically different to the idea that they happen to currently have a bunch of encrypted devices. Hopefully that clarifies, or we're just talking past each other.
So
it clarified. I'll save my comments for after Raphael.
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with you that it can be isomorphic, but there is one important prerequisite, and that is that we don't have like a cryptographically unlinked list of whatever we call it, pre-authorized users, etc. If we can have that list as part of an MLS extension, like a group context extension, or something that has equivalent security guarantees to that, then it becomes sort of interchangeable in a way, because then the only distinguishing factor is whether or not a user can read messages, and that has to do with two things. Rowan said that already. It has to do with the fact that whether a user has a device in the MLS group or whether there is crawlback. So those are the two things that are going to determine that. But then we would have the same level of control across this aggregated roster that we typically also have by just having an MLS group. But we should at all costs avoid a situation where we have unlinked states and where the source of truth lies outside of this combination of MLS group and pre-authorized users.
Okay, I see Rowan and Matthew in the queue. I don't know if those are left over from last time or if you guys have another round.
So I was just going to say to Matthew that I covered all of the join scenarios that I could think of in Draft Mimi group chat. So if you don't like the pre-authorization proposal and want to convince me that we should go and use, a roster with some attributes, then I would just say, in a couple of bullet points, if you could go through each of the use cases that I described in group chat and say, I would make these, this is what would happen to the roster, or this is how I would do this. That would be useful. And then also to describe under what circumstances we would need to go and send some MLS messages so that we could have this MLS agreement in the MLS case for whatever the roster is, or any changes to the roster. Does that sound good?
Yep, sounds good.
Cool.
Jonathan?
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on this sort of source of truth comment, because I think that's actually the core issue. I think we're using terminology and pretending it's a terminology problem. This isn't a terminology problem. It's a pretty fundamental design question on what's the source of truth. Right? Whenever you have two lists somewhere or two pieces of data, if you want consistency, you need to define one of them as a source of truth. And so I think there's two design decisions we can make, right? One is that the source of truth is this notion of this list, which I'm just going to call it a roster for a moment here. Call it whatever you want. But I'm going to use the word roster for this for just a moment. Call it a roster. The source of truth is what the hub maintains, and that bounds the MLS membership, right? So that's one view, and it basically serves as a umbrella for the authorization decisions that the clients would make when determining whether or not they're going to accept, for example, an external commit, right? So that's the source of truth, is the hub driven by Mimi and the proprietary protocols inside of a provider that we can't see. And then the other worldview is the opposite, which is that no, the MLS group membership is the source of truth, and the hub is basically storing a summary version of it. I think we should decide which of those worldviews we're following, and then the terminology can come from both. Thank you.
I was just going to say, if it's okay, that we need to choose.
Yeah, close the queue to try to wrap this up. I feel like we kind of beat this one to a pulp. Richard, would you like to summarize where you think we landed, and then I'll say a few things.
I think I may have to go through the notes in the audio recording, but as I was saying a minute ago, I think to first order, I think that sounds like there's some agreement that like we do have these two independent things. To JDR's point, we might need to find some way to give one priority over the other, but there are two track things. This list of users derived from the end-to-end encryption state and a list of policy users, pre-authorized users, or however we want to call them. So we've got some terminology work to do in the design to figure this out, but like at least we know what we're talking about now, at least to first order. The invite, I think we might need to do another iteration on this question of invites and the exact join process, but that's something we can handle in the design team. But I think we've got the first level concepts now. We can kind of take it to the design team and do the next level. Okay, that's all the content. So if we could skip past the next slide, I've got just like one little wrap up slide that says we're gonna go do some stuff. I think that aligning, that taxonomy of exactly what the state is and how we maintain it was basically the last big architectural question we had. I'm sure there will be more kind of design questions that come up with the next couple of layers, but this kind of transport, E2E control, policy control, message forwarding, message format, I think that's kind of the constellation of protocols we've got going in the sort of relationships to one another we discussed here. So like I said at the top, I think we're about on track to have something in place in September. We just need to get our wheels turning and going that, and we'll discuss further in the design team. So thank you. Thanks everyone for attending and contributing. It was super helpful to have to run these ideas we've been discussing in the design team past a larger group and get some broader feedback. And it'll be useful in getting us to closure and getting some useful products from working here. Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard, for shepherding us through that, and to the design team for all the work that you all put in. Obviously, we crushed our agenda today, so apologies to all of the discovery requirements presenters. Definitely really appreciate the work that you put into your drafts. This gives people a little bit more time to read them. I think we will dedicate the entirety of the next interim, which will be coming up in a couple of weeks, to discovery requirements, because the design team will still be busy working at that point. So we'll take the parts of the agenda that we missed today and shift them forward to the next interim, and then we'll come back at the end of September to the design team. I just put again the doodle poll for the September interims into the chat. It's also on the mailing list. I think Tim and I will look tomorrow morning Eastern time at the results and do the scheduling. So if you want to be there and you haven't filled it in yet, please fill that in tonight or tomorrow morning early. And had one other thing that I was going to remind people of, and now I completely forgot what it is. So, oh, I know. I did hear from some of our European folks that this is a tough time for interims, and definitely appreciate that. I think for the next round in October, we'll solicit some earlier times. It would be great to find a recurring time. So I don't know if people think that's feasible, but I'd love to stop doodling and just say every other week we meet at this time on this day. But I don't think it should be necessarily this particular time of day that we did this time, because it's so late in Europe. So anyway, if anybody has thoughts about that, feel free to email the chairs or the list, and we'll take that under consideration for future scheduling. Mallory, did you have something?
Well, yeah, it was just quickly a question to the design team. If that, obviously this is the work you're doing under this assumed architecture, but then if the chair's perspective is that is set, or if there are options to reconsider different architectures, what would that look like? Is it spinning up another design team, or just coming up with a competing draft? But maybe it's not a question I need an answer to right now, but maybe just a question to the design team, if you can I think, consider different assumptions. That's it.
I mean, I'll just give my perspective, and Richard, you can jump in. But I think from the working group's perspective, like it's not like an official design team. They're not working on working group documents, right? They're just like having pre-discussion and writing individual drafts. So for sure, like as these things come into the working group discussion, everything is up for debate, and we haven't, when we get to time for doing calls for adoption and calls working with last call and all those things, like there's many additional opportunities. So I don't think anything is really set in stone at this point. Anything else to add, Richard?
As Alyssa says, this is not a group working on working group deliverables at this point. The idea of the design team is to design something that is acceptable to the working group. And so if you have thoughts on what would be, if something different would be more acceptable to the working group, I think we'd be glad to hear them.
And we should definitely have discussion on the list in the meantime too, if people want to keep it up in between the interims, as always. Tim or anybody else have anything before we close out?
No, not me.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.